Clint Eastwood was driving through the evening streets of Los Angeles, enjoying the quiet and peace that the late hour brought. He usually preferred to avoid the noisy streets and hustle of the city, opting for solitude in his home or studio, where he could focus on his thoughts. On this evening, like many others, he was driving his usual route, heading home after a meeting with producers discussing a new project. The weather was pleasant, and the city seemed to be falling asleep. At the traffic light, something caught his attention. On the corner of the street, right by the crosswalk, a teenager was sitting. He was dressed in old, worn-out clothes, and his gaze was fixed on the distance, as if he had lost faith in this world. His appearance was unremarkable, nothing out of the ordinary except for the expression on his face. There was something troubling, hidden in it. Clint couldn't take his eyes off him. Everything felt so familiar. Suddenly their gazes met. This moment felt like more than just a casual glance between two people on the street. It seemed as if those eyes were looking straight into Clint's soul, as if they knew him better than he knew himself. Eyes full of disappointment and fear, yet at the same time despair, as if they were silently asking for help, but didn't know how to ask. Clint slowed down and stopped the car. He couldn't just drive past. He had always believed in the possibility of change and second chances, especially when it came to young people. Throughout his life, he had met many individuals who found themselves in difficult situations, and perhaps he could help. He rolled down the window and, hesitating slightly, spoke. "Hey, are you all right?" The teenager didn't respond immediately, just looked at him warily, as if unsure of what Clint wanted from him. Clint didn't insist, but his eyes were filled with compassion. He continued, "You know, you don't have to sit here. You can do much more than you think. I can help." The teenager finally shifted, as if waking from a deep thought. His gaze softened a little, but it was still cautious. He stood up and approached the car. His eyes didn't show confidence, only doubt. I don't know what to do," he said, not looking Clint in the eyes. "My life, it doesn't make sense." Clint opened the door and gestured for the teenager to sit next to him. His intuition told him that this moment wasn't random. "I understand," Clint said. "I had moments like that in my life, when everything seemed lost. But you know, life doesn't end until you give up. Sometimes all it takes is helping someone believe they have a chance." The teenager fell silent. He sat with his teeth clenched, and it seemed like his inner world was locked in a dark room with no way out. Despite this, Clint felt that the conversation was worth continuing. He didn't know why, but this boy was different. There was a struggle in him, one that Clint himself had faced in his youth. The feeling that he could save him was almost physically palpable. "What's your name?" Clint asked. "Jason," the teenager replied, not looking him in the eye. "Nice to meet you, Jason. Listen, I can help you. You can come with me, and we'll figure something out. I have a house, a job, and I can give you a chance to start fresh." Jason looked at Clint again. His gaze was still full of doubt, but something in Clint's voice made him pause for a moment. "I'm not sure I can," he said, but didn't finish the sentence. Clint looked at him and understood that this boy, like so many others, was going through something very difficult. He clearly wasn't ready to admit his helplessness, but there was a lot of pain in his silence. "Listen," Clint said softly, "it all starts with the first step. Sometimes you just have to trust. You're not alone. I was just like you once. And you know, I don't regret that I got help. That's all it takes. Help, a chance." Are you ready to take it? Jason nodded silently. Perhaps he didn't fully believe, but he had no other choice. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was willing to try anything. His life had felt hopeless, but who knew? Maybe Clint Eastwood was the person who could give him a new chance. Clint paid the taxi driver, offering to give Jason a ride to his home, and soon they were on their way together. Jason didn't say a word, but now his eyes were not the same as before. They were filled with some new feeling. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was fear of the unknown, but it was the first step towards something new. From that moment on, Jason's life began to change. From that moment, he had to learn to trust people, and at some point, he would realize that even if things weren't easy, the chance for a better future was worth fighting for. Clint Eastwood drove through the familiar streets of Los Angeles, but his thoughts were far from the daily concerns. Jason sat beside him, silently lost in his thoughts. Clint didn't try to cheer him up or ask about his life. He knew the boy was going through tough times, and that every step he took needed to be careful. However, one thing was clear. Jason was ready to make an attempt to change his life. That was already more than Clint could have hoped for. When they arrived at Clint's house, Jason looked somewhat tense. This neighborhood was quiet, even secluded, and the whole city seemed to be sinking into the evening calm. Clint parked in front of his large, cozy house, turned off the engine, and said, "This is my home. You can stay here if you want. It's peaceful. I'll try to help you find your way." Jason didn't answer, but his gaze softened. He seemed to have not expected such hospitality. He stayed silent for a long time, watching Clint, as if trying to figure out if there was something behind this offer that he couldn't quite grasp. "You don't have to do anything," Clint added, trying to ease the tension. "Just live here. Take your time. First, let's figure out what you need. Then we'll decide what to do." They entered the house. It was cozy, with high ceilings, surrounded by a spacious yard and evergreens. The walls were decorated with paintings, many of which Clint had created himself. He wasn't just an actor, but also a talented artist, and his works reflected a deep inner strength and understanding. The house was warm and bright, instantly creating a sense of comfort. Clint offered Jason a seat on the sofa and poured him a cup of coffee. Jason looked at the drink, but probably didn't know how to act in such a situation. He picked up the cup and took a couple of sips, but seemed awkward. Clint understood that this might be his first normal home experience in a long time. "Don't worry, Jason. Nobody here will tell you what to do," Clint said, sitting across from him. "I just want you to feel at home. And if you ever want to talk, you can always come to me. I've always had a hard time talking about my feelings, but it's important. It could be the first step towards your future." The teenager looked at him with surprise, as if not knowing how to respond. But there was something new in his eyes, a small spark that Clint noticed immediately. Perhaps it was hope, maybe just fear of change. But still, it was a step forward. The next few days passed in silent tranquility. Jason kept to himself, trying not to stand out. But with each passing day, his behavior became more open. Clint suggested he take a few courses and helped him look for work. Jason was willing to try, though he remained cautious. In the kitchen, where they often prepared simple dinners, Clint once shared his story with him. He spoke about his youth when he lived in poverty and didn't know where to go. He talked about how often he had made mistakes, how the people around him had also made mistakes, but how important it was to believe in the possibility of change. Jason listened attentively, but he couldn't always understand how such things could help him. He was too young, too hurt to easily accept such words. Soon, Clint suggested that Jason go for an interview at a local hardware store. Jason was nervous, unsure of what to expect, but Clint reassured him that he didn't have to worry. He had been through a lot himself, and now he wanted to help someone else understand that even small steps could lead to big changes. "Just be yourself," Clint said, "and if you don't like it, you can always try something else. The important thing is not to give up." The next morning, Jason went for the interview. He didn't know how to behave, but Clint convinced him that he just needed to be honest and open. And so, a few hours later, Jason returned to Clint's house, his face a little brighter. "Did you get the job?" Clint asked. Jason nodded, smiling a bit sheepishly. "Yeah, I start tomorrow. It was easier than I thought." Clint felt a sense of relief. He knew that this moment had become significant. Perhaps it was only the first step, but it was a step toward change. In the meantime, Jason began to adapt to life at Clint's house. He started helping around the house, sometimes even cooking dinner. Gradually, his confidence grew, and he no longer seemed like the lost teenager he had been at the start. But Clint knew this wasn't the end. Jason was too young to immediately grasp all the important lessons. He was still on his path, and this was just the beginning. However, despite all the efforts, Clint continued to feel that Jason was hiding something from him. He didn't try to push him, but he intuitively knew that his ward wasn't quite ready to fully open up. Maybe not yet, but Clint was willing to wait. He knew that it wasn't just about help, it was about time. Time they both needed to learn to trust each other. A week later, Clint asked Jason to accompany him to a meeting with another acquaintance who could help him with additional training. Jason agreed, and despite his doubts, Clint saw it as another step forward. However, as it turned out later, this meeting would be only the first introduction to the more complicated problems that Jason would soon face on his journey. Several weeks passed, and it seemed that Jason had begun to adjust to his new life. He worked at his new job at the hardware store, learned to use tools and stack materials, and even made a few friends. Clint watched his progress with pride, knowing this was just the beginning. However, no matter how hard Jason tried, his inner demons had not disappeared, and Clint sensed that the changes were only skin deep. One evening, a week after his successful interview, Jason returned home, late. He was tired, but there was something new in his eyes, something Clint couldn't immediately understand. Jason quickly entered the house, avoiding Clint's gaze, and went straight to his room. "Are you okay?" Clint asked, approaching the door. "Yeah, everything's fine," Jason replied without turning. Clint frowned, but didn't press. He knew Jason needed personal space, especially to sort out his feelings. But the next day, his behavior became more strange. He grew secretive, stopped talking to Clint, and avoided discussions about his day. This was nothing like the Jason Clint had known just a month ago. He started being late for work, and when he did speak, words came out that he would never have used before. At some point, Clint realized that Jason was hiding something again, and that something was happening in his life that he couldn't control. When Clint peeked into Jason's room to talk to him, he wasn't alone. Through the window, Clint saw two guys leaving his room, one of them looking familiar. It was the guy from the streets that Clint had seen nearby. They were dressed in stylish but worn-out clothes, walking confidently as if they were used to life in the city. They were whispering something quickly to Jason, and though he seemed to resist, he eventually gave in to their persuasion. Clint's heart clenched. He couldn't understand what was going on. All his efforts, everything he had invested in helping this boy, seemed to be in danger. He immediately walked toward Jason. "Jason, who were they?" he asked, peering into the room. The two guys quickly left, leaving Jason with Clint. He looked awkward and guilty. "They... old acquaintances," Jason said, avoiding Clint's gaze. "We just ran into each other by chance." Clint felt his irritation begin to grow, but he kept his composure. He didn't want to pressure Jason, but he knew this was a serious moment. "This is no coincidence, Jason," Clint said, his voice firm but calm. "I've seen them before. You need to understand that those people are not your path. You can't just go back to your old habits." Jason remained silent, his face darkening. He didn't know how to respond to Clint's words. A storm was raging in his mind, and it was hard to tell what was right and what wasn't. On one hand, he felt guilty toward Clint. On the other, the old life, his old friends, were tempting him back, promising an easier path. "You don't understand," he finally said, unable to hold it in. "They're my friends. They get me. You don't understand what that means, do you?" Clint closed his eyes for a moment. He knew that every teenager faced these kinds of choices at some point. He had been at a crossroads himself once, and it was those choices that had shaped his character. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not this time. "I understand more than you think, Jason," Clint replied, his voice softening. "I've been where you are. I know what it means to struggle with yourself. But your life is in your hands now. If you decide to go down the old paths again, you could lose everything you have. I won't stand by and watch you destroy yourself." Jason sighed heavily, lowering his head. Clint saw his face change. He was once again the confused teenager who didn't know where to go or who to trust. This wasn't easy. It was a trial that could either break him or make him stronger. Clint realized that this time he had to act decisively. "I can't make you do anything," Clint continued, his gaze becoming more serious. "But you have to understand that if you keep going this way, you'll end up on the streets again. You could lose everything, your home, your job, everything we've built together. I can't just stand by if you choose this path again." Jason lifted his head and looked at him. His eyes were full of pain and doubt. He knew Clint was right, but two forces were fighting inside him: fear of his old life and hope for a new one. He couldn't choose. "I don't want to lose everything," he whispered, but his voice lacked confidence. "I just don't know what to do." Clint walked up to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. He knew this wasn't the end, but it wasn't the beginning of a new path either. This was a struggle that was only beginning. "You're not alone, Jason," Clint said, with a firmness that only someone who had been through similar struggles could understand. "You're not alone. You can always come back here. I'll be right here, but you have to be ready for change." Jason silently nodded, but uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. Clint knew this moment wouldn't be the last, and that there would be no turning back. They both stood at the edge, and now everything depended on Jason's choice. Several weeks had passed since Clint and Jason had openly talked about his old friends and the life he might leave behind. Although Jason promised Clint he wouldn't return to his old habits, it was clear that the pressure from the outside world hadn't eased. His old acquaintances wouldn't leave him alone, and Jason found himself at a crossroads once again. One evening after work, Clint noticed that Jason was acting strangely. He had become more withdrawn, often retreating to his room, and in the evenings he would leave without telling Clint where he was going. This went on for several days. Clint tried to talk to him, but Jason brushed him off, saying everything was fine. However, one night, when Jason returned home late, he looked dejected and confused. He could barely stand, his gaze clouded, and his hand shook as he tried to put his bag down on the table. "Jason, what happened?" Clint immediately asked, noticing how unnatural his appearance was. His heart skipped a beat. Clint knew something had happened, but couldn't understand what. Jason silently collapsed into a chair. His face was etched with worry, and his eyes couldn't hide the bitterness of what he had just experienced. I ran into them again, he said finally, his voice trembling. You were right, Clint. I knew it was a mistake, but they made me... I couldn't say no. Clint felt a sharp pain in his chest. He had expected to hear something like this, but that didn't make it any easier. In moments like these, all his efforts to help seemed in vain. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress his disappointment. You're back with them? Clint asked, trying to stay calm. You've gone back to those who don't help you. You've gone back to those who pull you down. Jason nodded. His shoulders slumped, and he couldn't meet Clint's gaze. Clint knew the boy was on the edge. He had just taken a step backward from what could have been a new beginning. But now he was standing on the brink of a cliff. There was no one but himself who could help Jason climb back out. Clint walked over and sat next to him, looking at him with a serious expression. Why did you do this? He asked softly. Do you understand that your life is really in your hands, Jason? You don't have to fall back into the pit that's been destroying you. Jason remained silent, his face twisted in inner conflict. Clint continued speaking. Do you think all your problems will disappear if you go back to your old friends? They won't give you anything, Jason. They'll lead you to the same place. The young man sobbed, but quickly regained control. His lips trembled, as if he couldn't find the words to explain what had been happening to him. Clint saw real confusion in him, but he also understood that the boy was deeply tangled up in this situation. It was too hard for him, and Clint knew that words wouldn't always be enough. I understand, Jason said, his voice barely audible, but I just can't live the way you want me to. I don't know how to do it. Clint stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the night, at the city lights flickering in the distance. He felt that this was the moment when there would be no second chance if he didn't do everything he could to help. His decision was clear. You're not alone, Jason, Clint said, turning back around. I know you don't understand how to change your life, but you have to believe that change is possible. You've already taken a step forward, and you can't give up now. You chose me to believe in yourself, and I will be here. But if you don't want it, no one can help you. Jason sat silently, his eyes filled with pain and doubt. He didn't know how to move forward, but there was a certain determination in this conversation that he hadn't felt before. Clint understood that this moment could be pivotal. It wasn't just a promise, it was an internal test that Jason had to pass. Do you remember what I told you at the beginning? Clint asked. You have to believe in the possibility of change, Jason. It's not easy. I understand. But you have to realize that no old life will save you. You have to become the master of your own fate. Jason looked up at Clint, and there was something new in his eyes. Fear, but also hope. He had finally realized that the path he had been on wasn't easy, but it was meaningful. He could keep searching for easy ways, but he knew they wouldn't lead him anywhere better. A faint smile appeared on his face. I'll try, he said quietly. I'll try, Clint. Clint placed his hand on Jason's shoulder, feeling the tension begin to lift. This wasn't the end. It was only a new step, and though it was clear that more difficult choices awaited Jason, at least now he knew he had a chance to make the right one. Months had passed since Jason promised Clint that he would try to change his life. Clint watched as the young man gradually pulled himself out of the dark pit he had once dug for himself. Despite all the challenges, Jason was holding on to the chance he had been given. He had started working seriously and even began seeing a psychologist that Clint had suggested. Clint saw progress, but he also knew he couldn't relax. The road to recovery was long and rocky, and Jason was far from free of his internal battles. One day, after work, Jason came home with an unusually calm expression. He sat on the couch and stayed silent for a long time, seemingly lost in his thoughts. Clint sat across from him, waiting for him to initiate the conversation. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was much lighter than it had been before. "Today, they told me I have a chance to get a promotion at work," Jason finally said, lifting his eyes. His voice wasn't filled with excitement, more of an astonished surprise that such an opportunity had even been offered to him. Clint smiled, feeling a wave of relief. He knew how hard Jason had been working, and even though he still struggled with self-doubt, this was a small victory. But Clint also knew that Jason needed more than just recognition of his successes. He needed support, so he wouldn't backslide. "That's great," Clint said, his voice full of genuine pride. "You've worked hard for this, Jason. But it's important for you to realize that your recovery isn't just a series of good events. It's an everyday choice you make. You have to stay strong, despite all the temptations to turn back." Jason nodded. He knew those weren't just words. He had lost a lot along the way, and it was all on his shoulders. The understanding that he was now living a different life, that he had chosen a different path, was both a relief and a huge responsibility. "I don't want to lose everything again, Clint," he said, his voice steady but full of fear. "But sometimes I feel like I don't have enough confidence to hold on. These old connections, they will always pull me back." Clint looked at him with understanding. He knew how hard it was to let go of the past, especially when it kept knocking at the door. Yet, this was the defining moment. The moment when Jason had to make the final decision. "You're right," Clint said. "Those connections won't disappear. You'll face them, probably for the rest of your life. But you have to learn to stand firm and not give in. You've learned to work hard. You have a future, and this is your chance. You control your life now. Remember that, even when it gets tough." Jason sat quietly, reflecting on Clint's words. He still felt that lingering fear, and he couldn't completely shake the thought of his old friends and those who might try to pull him back into the old life. But deep down, he knew he couldn't allow them to destroy what he had built. This was his chance, his new beginning, and if he didn't seize it, everything he had done so far would have been meaningless. The next day, Jason made an important decision. He met with people from his old circle, but this time he was ready. He knew he was going to face those who might try to manipulate him and drag him back into his past, but he was determined. On this day, he made the decision to leave the past behind. "I can't be with you anymore," Jason said, standing before his old acquaintances. "I've chosen a different path. I'm working on myself, and I'm not going back to where I came from. I have to walk my own way." His words were firm with resolve, and he wasn't afraid of the consequences. Clint had been right. The choice was his alone. He couldn't let his life fall back into the hands of those who were ready to tear it apart. And although his old friends tried to persuade him, he stood his ground. When Jason returned home, he felt a sense of relief, as if a heavy stone had been lifted from his shoulders. He understood that this wasn't the end of his struggle, but it was an important step toward a new life. "You did it," Clint said when Jason walked through the door. "I'm proud of you." Jason stood before him, a small smile on his face, but his eyes were full of determination. "Thank you for everything, Clint. I don't know what I would have done without you." Clint just nodded. He knew that this path wouldn't end here, and that Jason would face many more trials. But now that he had taken this step, Clint knew he could handle whatever came his way. He had seen the young man begin to change, and he knew Jason would fight until the end. "You did it yourself," Clint replied with a smile. "I just helped you believe in yourself." And in that moment, Clint knew that it was moments like this, decisions like these, that made life a true victory.